Like many South Africans, glued to our screens yesterday after 11 a.m. South African time to the start of that ICJ case brought by South Africa in The Hague in against Israel. An impassioned and I think a very direct presentation by South Africa's legal team at The Hague. I think 5 points that the South African presentation put across is that, one, Israeli officials meant what they said when they uttered genocidal statements. They're talking about the intent, spoke about Israel's supposedly humanitarian actions. Are they, or lack of humanitarian actions, whether they have been contributing to genocide? Also looking at Israel as an occupying power in Gaza. Janet Addison is a broadcaster and journalist who has covered The Hague extensively. She joins me now on the line. Good morning, Janet. Really appreciate your time. Let me first draw about attention to the international interest of this particular case. You've covered The Hague in many, many cases. I've heard a report from a South African journalist that usually about 30 media is on average present at The Hague for other cases. But there's been something like 150 applications for media observations inside the Palace of Justice. What has been the media attention or the global attention that you can observe regarding this case? Good morning.
Good morning, Lester. Yeah, this has been, I think, the biggest case that the ICJ has had to deal with. I can imagine only amongst the officials behind the scenes trying to cope with that flood of applications. There are large numbers of people also gathered in the very cold weather just in front of the gates. And we've had a little bit of confrontation between the pro-Israeli and the pro-Palestinian sides there. I mean, I think that's just a measure of how much world attention there is to this particular case. Each case that goes to the ICJ is really important in the places where it's happening. So often you have individual media who are very, very interested, but this one is global.
Let's look at South Africa's presentation. In my analysis, South Africa presented a case that was not just for the court, piecemeal presentations that wasn't just for the court, but also for an international audience, lawyers speaking to the court, but also to those who are watching. Your thoughts on South Africa's presentation?
Most of the observers that I have read on this say that they thought it was an extremely effective application because it did a number of different things. It really tackled the legal side. There are really big legal issues here. To prove genocide is really, really tough in legal terms. You have a lot to say about how to prove intent there, and they tackled that. They tackled some of the issues of the procedural side. But right at the beginning, what the actual South African officials, those from the foreign ministry and so on, did was that they presented this as a historical context. They said this was a part of a continuum of attacks. I think that was very much the public side. That was aimed at particularly a Palestinian audience, to show solidarity and to show exactly where South Africa places itself in the world.
Adila Hassem, who led South Africa's legal case, said something interesting, that they want to avoid the theatre of spectacle, that South Africa had chosen instead to focus on law, the rights of individuals and a collective. But the South African presentation, it only quotes UN agencies, the 15 special rapporteurs and UN organizations and agency bodies. The ICJ is, of course, a body, an organ of the United Nations, unlike the ICC, which operates independently. So the South African team is essentially asking the court, an agency of the United Nations, whether or not it believes the word and the observations of other UN agencies.
In some previous cases, for example, Myanmar versus Gambia, which was also about genocide. We saw that the court picked up exactly what a United Nations fact-finding mission had said, and said, okay, on that basis we can make some decisions. So it was very clever of the South African delegation to focus very specifically on the words of the United Nations. They did repeat that. I mean, again and again, there was this phrase, nowhere is safe, which was quoted from, I think, the United Nations Secretary General even. So those kinds of quotes really resonate with the court because they have to take the other organs of the United Nations seriously, what they have to say.
What are we expecting from a Israeli rebuttal today, with a pretty cogent case set forward by South Africa? They would need to respond to South Africa's allegations put forward. What are we expecting an Israeli defense to be?
We don't know exactly what the Israeli defense will be. They haven't said anything. Last night, we got some very strange reactions out of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, where they started accusing the lawyers of being Hamas agents, which definitely would not go down well with the court, with the judges. I mean, it's a really, I mean, this is kind of the height of diplomacy, this particular court. Everything is done in a very specific style, in a very formal way. You don't go around calling other lawyers agents of terrorism. It's just not done. So that, because you also saw, for example, the Irish lawyer at one point speaking in French, apologizing for not having provided all of the detailed arguments in French, because that is the language of the court as well as in as English. She was just making it clear how much respect the South Africans have for the court. So what the Israelis have to say, there's been a lot of speculation that they might use some of the elements of the very shocking videos referring to October 7th, the terrible attacks that Hamas did against the Israeli citizens. And that's also why South Africa said in advance, we will not be showing these kinds of things ourselves, possibly to provide a contrast with what the Israeli side might do. Would those kinds of shocking videos have any effect on the judges? Nobody thinks that they would. That's not what this argument is about. It's about the legal side. So they really need to focus in the issue of how they say that we are defending ourselves. They need to focus in on self-defense. They need to focus in on the allegation of indiscriminate attacks and say they're not indiscriminate. They need to be able to say that this is because Hamas is using Palestinian citizens as human shields, and therefore we have to do this. They really need to get into the meat of what South Africa had to say. They've only got 3 hours to do it, though, so they've got a lot of ground to cover.
Janet, we don't know what the court will decide, and I would believe that whatever decision a court reaches is done so on the legal merits of that case. But we also have to look at the 15 judges, plus the 2 seconded by South Africa and Israel, to the bench of the ICJ. They come from 15 different countries. 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council sit on that bench. The rest rotate. Is it guaranteed that this case is judged on its legal merit, or also there is a chance on whatever geopolitical stance that a judge may come with, being part of a national bloc? Your thoughts on how diplomacy, geopolitics play into a court, which is also a agency of the United Nations, as imperfect as it is?
These judges don't take orders from their national governments. That's not the way that they operate. But each judge is a product of their education and their experience. And therefore, the Chinese judge does represent that whole body of a way of looking at the world that China has. Doesn't mean to say that they're going to follow exactly what the Chinese government wants them to do, but they're not going to kind of shed all of that behind them and just, all of their whole experience. That's why you have 15 judges. So they are meant to represent the whole world. In fact, the UK, even though it's a permanent member of the Security Council, lost its position because everybody was so fed up with the way that the British were dealing with the Chagos situation, which is again something that's come to the International Court of Justice, and an Indian judge got elected in their place. So that starts to show you the way that the world is changing gradually. I do think that these judges will vote in the end, because they all have to make their own individual decisions, and then that's collated into a joint decision. They will come up with something quite conservative. They will not necessarily agree with all of the requests that South Africa is making. This is not the stage at which there is a decision as to whether genocide has been committed or not. It is just whether there is a case that has been made that things are really bad and they could be very much worse unless the court says something needs to change. They could just tell South Africa, yes, we agree with you, and Israel has to abide by the laws of war. And Israel could say, yeah, well, fine, of course, we're doing that anyway. So it could be as damp a squib as that in the end. We just don't know.
Because last year there was a case between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine went to the ICJ. The ICJ agreed, called on Russia to call on a ceasefire in Ukraine. Russia has ignored that. And something similar could happen. In terms of a binding resolution, what hope is there after this case? Of course, we don't know the outcome of this case just yet, but looking at what has happened in a Ukraine-Russia case, Russia has largely ignored an instruction by the ICJ.
I mean, let's say they say there has to be an immediate ceasefire, and let's say Israel says, no, we're still doing our mopping up, we've still got some Hamas to kill there. Nothing will happen, because the only enforcement mechanism could possibly be the Security Council. And there you're talking about coming back to your sort of who's on the permanent five, who has veto power. It will not be possible to force the issue there. So what we end up with is more of, let's say, of a moral victory, let's say, for the Palestinian side and for South Africa, and for further pressure that can be put on countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, to say you shouldn't be supplying weapons to a country that has had provisional measures taken against him at the highest court of the United Nations, and where there is a risk of genocide.
Janet Anderson, really appreciate your time. A journalist, broadcaster, and a regular observer at the ICJ at The Hague. Really appreciate your time.